What if the place they threw you away to die was worth more than everything they took from you? At 68, Ruth Gable stood on her own porch with an eviction notice nailed to the door she had lived in for 40 years. By nightfall, she would be homeless. By winter, she was expected to be dead. The bank had taken her house, her savings, and every memory tied to her husband. But the one thing they didn't take, the worthless land deep in the Black Hills, was the one mistake that would cost them everything. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 3 months earlier, the system had already decided her life was over. Ruth Gable had always believed that if you worked hard enough, paid your bills, and kept your word, life would leave you something in return. Not luxury, not miracles, just something steady, something safe. She had spent 4 decades building that life in a modest house on a quiet street in Rapid City. The kind of place where neighbors waved but didn't ask too many questions. The kind of place where every corner held a memory that felt earned. And then Frank got sick. It didn't happen all at once, it never did. First it was fatigue, then the appointments, then the words no one ever expected to hear but always feared anyway. Treatment became routine. Bills followed behind like shadows that grew longer every month. Frank never complained. Even when the treatments wore him down to something smaller than the man he used to be, he still tried to smile at her, still tried to tell her it would be all right. It wasn't. By the time it was over, the house was already tied up in loans and extensions. Savings were gone. Retirement funds had disappeared into numbers printed on medical statements that no one ever fully explained. Frank passed away on a grey morning that didn't feel any different from the ones before it. That was what hurt the most. The world didn't stop. It didn't even slow down, and neither did the bills. Ruth tried. She called offices. She asked for extensions. She explained things more times than she could count. Every conversation sounded the same. Polite voices, careful language, no solutions. The letters started arriving soon after. Final notices, legal warnings, statements printed in bold ink that made everything feel colder. By the time Harrison Caldwell showed up at her door, the outcome had already been decided. He stood there in a tailored coat that looked out of place on her porch, holding a folder under one arm like it belonged to him more than anything inside her house ever had. His expression carried something close to sympathy, but it never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his tone measured, controlled. "I'm here regarding the foreclosure process." She didn't invite him in. He didn't expect her to. He explained things in clean, simple sentences, too simple for what they meant. The property had been seized, the debt remained, the house would be transferred. There was a buyer already lined up. "Friday," he said, glancing briefly at the paper in his hand. "You'll need to vacate by 5 p.m. 40 years reduced to a deadline." Ruth stood there without interrupting him, without arguing. Not because she agreed, but because she understood something he didn't need to say. There was no conversation left to have. When he finished, he placed the totus against the doorframe and secured it with a sharp press. The sound echoed more than it should have, like something final being sealed in place. "If you have any remaining personal belongings," he added, "I suggest you arrange for transportation as soon as possible." He paused, then offered the closest thing to reassurance he could manage. "There is one asset still in your name, a parcel of land outside the city. It was not included in the foreclosure." Ruth blinked slowly. "What land?" "A tract in the Black Hills. 40 acres. No residential structure of value. It's effectively unusable." Unusable. He said it like a kindness, like he was leaving her with something. She remembered then. Frank had bought it years ago at an auction. Something cheap. Something he had laughed about afterward. A useless piece of land no one wanted. She had forgotten about it. Apparently, so had the bank. Caldwell closed his folder. "I'm sorry for your situation, Mrs. Gable." He wasn't. He turned and walked back to his car without waiting for a response. Ruth stayed on the porch long after he left. The paper on the door shifted slightly in the wind, making a faint tapping sound against the wood, over and over again. Inside, the house felt smaller, quieter, like it had already begun to let go of her. She moved through it slowly, touching things without meaning to. The edge of the kitchen counter, the back of a chair, The worn handle of a cabinet Frank had fixed more times than she could count. There wasn't much to pack. That was the part no one ever talked about. When everything gets taken, what's left fits into boxes faster than you expect. By Friday afternoon, 4 cardboard boxes sat in the bed of Frank's old pickup truck. The engine struggled when she turned the key, coughing once before settling into a low, uneven hum. She didn't look back at the house when she drove away. There was nothing left there that belonged to her. The road out of Rapid City stretched long and quiet, leading toward the hills where the land waited, a place she barely remembered, a place no one had wanted. The sky grew darker as she drove, the air colder the farther she went. By the time the paved road gave way to dirt, the sun was already dipping low behind the ridgeline. Ruth slowed the truck as the tires crunched over loose gravel and broken ground. The path ahead was narrow, uneven, barely visible in places where grass had grown back over it. This was it. This was what they had left her. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her hands trembling just enough for her to notice. And as the last light faded across the hills, Ruth Gable drove deeper into the one place the world had decided was worthless, without knowing it was the only place that could save her. The road narrowed until it barely deserved to be called a road at all. Ruth kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, leaning forward slightly as if that would help her see better through the dimming light. The truck's headlights cut a thin path through dry brush and scattered rock, the beams bouncing with every rut and dip. She almost missed the turn. A faded wooden post stood crooked at the edge of a barely visible trail. No sign, no marker, just a suggestion that someone had once meant for this path to be found. Ruth slowed, then turned the wheel, guiding the truck onto ground that felt more like a memory than a road. The tires crunched, then slipped slightly before catching again. She eased off the gas, letting the truck crawl forward. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. No houses, no distant traffic, just wind moving across the hills in long, hollow breaths. By the time she saw the cabin, the sky had gone from gray to almost black. It stood on a slight rise, leaning just enough to make her uneasy before she even stepped out of the truck. One side of the roof had collapsed inward, leaving jagged lines where wood had given up years ago. The door hung crooked, barely attached at the hinges. Ruth turned off the engine. The silence that followed felt heavier than the drive. For a moment she stayed inside, her hands still resting on the wheel. This was it. This was what had been left behind when everything else was taken. Not a safety net. Not even a place someone could pretend was livable. Just something forgotten. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The air bit immediately, sharp and dry, carrying the faint smell of dust and something older beneath it. The kind of smell that didn't belong to anything alive. The ground beneath her boots shifted slightly as she walked toward the cabin. Loose gravel, broken wood. She paused halfway, glancing back at the truck as if it might still offer some kind of escape. It didn't. Ruth moved closer and pushed the door with the flat of her hand. It gave way with a long, splintering creak, swinging inward just enough for her to slip through. Inside, the darkness was thick. Not the soft kind that came with night, but something heavier. Something that settled into corners and stayed there. She reached back into the truck, grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a single open room. A rusted stove sat in the center, its pipe running crookedly toward the ceiling. The floorboards were warped and uneven, some of them cracked clean through. A broken table leaned against one wall, its legs no longer even. There was no insulation, no wiring, no sign that anyone had been here in years. Ruth stepped fully inside and let the door fall behind her. The sound echoed more than it should have, bouncing off the empty walls and settling into the silence again. "This is it," she whispered, though there was no one to hear it. Her voice sounded strange in the space, like it didn't belong to her. She set the flashlight down on the table, angling it so the beam spread across the room. Then she walked slowly along the perimeter, testing each step before putting her full weight down. The boards held, but only just. When she reached the far side of the cabin, she noticed something else. A square outline in the floor. It was faint, almost hidden beneath dirt and splinters, but the edges were too straight to be natural. Ruth crouched down, brushing away debris with her hand. A wooden panel, hinged, a cellar door. She sat back on her heels, staring at it for a long moment. Frank had never mentioned a cellar. Then again, Frank had never thought this place would matter. Ruth pushed herself to her feet and stepped away from the panel. One problem at a time. She wasn't going down there tonight. Not in the dark. Not when she didn't even know if the floor would hold. Instead, she turned her attention to what she could control. The roof. She stepped back outside, grabbing a torn tarp from the truck bed along with a small toolbox she barely remembered packing. The wind had picked up, tugging at the loose edges of her coat as she climbed the shallow slope toward the cabin's side. The climb wasn't easy. Her foot slipped once, sending a small cascade of gravel sliding down behind her. She caught herself on a jagged edge of wood, the rough surface biting into her palm. She didn't stop. By the time she reached the broken section of the roof, her breath had grown shallow, her chest tightening with each movement. She pulled herself up carefully, positioning the tarp over the largest gap and securing it with whatever nails she could find still holding in place. The wind fought her the entire time, snapping the tarp like it wanted it gone. Twice she nearly lost her grip, but she held on, because there wasn't another option. When she finally climbed down, her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort it took to keep going when everything in her body told her to stop. Inside, the cabin felt only slightly less exposed. The tarp muffled the wind, turning its howl into something lower, more distant. Ruth gathered what scraps she could find, broken boards, old crates, and stacked them near the stove. It wasn't much, not enough for more than a night or two if she was careful. She sat down on the floor beside it, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. For the first time since leaving the house, she allowed herself to feel it. Not just the loss, but the emptiness that followed. The space where everything familiar had once been, 40 years reduced to a few boxes in the back of a truck. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the wall. For a moment she could almost hear Frank's voice, not clearly, not enough to make out words, just the sense of it, steady, certain, as if he had always believed she would find a way through. A sudden sound broke the stillness, low, deep, almost like a breath pulled from somewhere beneath the floor. Ruth's eyes snapped open. The sound came again, longer this time, a hollow shifting noise that didn't belong to the wind. It seemed to rise from below, moving through the boards and into the air around her. She turned slowly toward the square outline in the floor, the cellar door. Another sound followed, sharper now, a faint creak, then a dull thud as if something deep underground had shifted its weight. Ruth didn't move, didn't breathe. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. And for the first time since arriving, she realized something that made the cold feel sharper than before. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was still alive. And whatever was beneath her had just woken up. Ruth did not move for several seconds. The sound came again, low and dragging, like something deep underground shifting against itself. It wasn't rhythmic. It wasn't mechanical. It felt old, as if it had been happening long before she ever set foot on this land. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cellar door. The outline in the floor looked darker now, as if the shadows around it had thickened. The flashlight beam trembled slightly, though she hadn't touched it. Wind, she whispered to herself, though the word didn't carry much weight, just the wind. But the cabin walls weren't moving anymore. The tarp overhead flapped faintly, but the sound beneath her feet didn't match it. It was slower, deeper. Ruth forced herself to stand. She wasn't going down there, not tonight. Not with nothing but a flashlight and a floor that might give out beneath her. She took a step back, then another, until she reached the stove again. The practical part of her mind pushed forward. Heat first, shelter, stay alive. Everything else could wait. She crouched down and started arranging the scraps of wood she had gathered, stacking them carefully inside the rusted stove. Her hands moved slower than they used to, but they were steady. That mattered more now. When she struck the lighter, the small flame flickered weakly before catching. It took longer than she expected for the wood to respond, but eventually a thin line of smoke curled upward, followed by the faint glow of fire. The heat was barely noticeable at first, but it was something. Ruth pulled a broken chair closer and sat down, keeping her hands near the stove as the warmth slowly spread. The sounds beneath the floor faded after a while, or maybe she just stopped hearing them. Exhaustion crept in instead. Not the kind that came from a long day, but something heavier. Something that settled deep into her bones, the kind that made it harder to think, harder to care. She leaned back against the wall again, closing her eyes. For a moment she thought she heard Frank laugh. It was quick, faint, gone before she could be sure it had been real, but it pulled something tight in her chest. "You always did pick the worst places?" she murmured softly, her voice barely carrying. The memory didn't comfort her the way she expected. It made the silence feel louder. Sometime during the night, the temperature dropped further. The small fire struggled to hold. Ruth woke with a sharp intake of breath, her fingers stiff, her shoulders aching from the cold. The stove had burned down to embers. She pushed herself upright, her joints protesting immediately. For a moment she couldn't feel her feet properly, just a dull numbness that spread upward. "That's not going to work," she muttered. She moved to the door and pushed it open. The cold outside hit her harder than before, the air sharper, thinner. The sky had cleared overnight, leaving everything exposed to the biting morning chill. Her breath came out in thin clouds. Ruth scanned the area, her eyes moving across the slope, the scattered rock, the thin line of trees in the distance. There wasn't much to work with, no easy solution waiting to be found. But there had to be something. She stepped down from the cabin and walked a short distance, testing the ground with each step. The cold made everything feel more brittle. The earth itself seemed less forgiving. A small pile of broken wood lay near the edge of the clearing, half buried under dust and debris, old crates maybe, left behind from when this place had still meant something to someone. Ruth crouched beside it and began pulling pieces free. Some crumbled immediately in her hands. Others held together just enough to be useful. She gathered what she could, stacking it carefully against her hip before carrying it back to the cabin. By the time she returned inside, her breath was uneven again, her hands trembling, not just from effort, but from the cold that refused to loosen its grip. She added the new wood to the stove and coaxed the fire back to life. This time she didn't sit, she moved. Back and forth across the cabin, checking the walls, pressing against boards, testing what might hold and what wouldn't. It wasn't much, but it gave her something to focus on. Something to push against the quiet. The cellar door stayed where it was, still, silent, but it drew her attention anyway. Every few minutes her eyes flicked toward it. By midday the sky had shifted again. Gray clouds rolled in from the west, thick and low. The wind picked up, stronger than before, carrying a sharp edge that hinted at something worse coming. Ruth stepped outside and looked up. She didn't need a forecast to understand what that meant. Storm, soon. She turned back toward the cabin, her jaw tightening. The tarp wouldn't hold under heavy snow. The walls barely held under wind, and the firewood she had gathered wouldn't last more than a day. 2 if she stretched it. "That's not enough," she said quietly. Her gaze drifted again to the floor, to the cellar, to whatever lay beneath it. If this place had been used before, there had to be more down there, supplies, tools, something left behind by the people who had once worked this land, or at the very least more wood. Ruth stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. The air felt different now, heavier, not from the cold, from the decision settling into place. She walked slowly toward the square outline in the floor and stopped just short of it. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she bent down, brushing away the last layer of dirt that clung to the edges of the panel. The wood beneath her fingers felt old but solid enough. The hinge creaked when she tested it, loud, too loud in the quiet of the cabin. Ruth hesitated, not because she was afraid of the dark, because she understood something else now. Once she opened it, there was no pretending this place was just shelter anymore. It was something else, something deeper, something that had already started reaching up toward her. She tightened her grip and pulled. The cellar door lifted with a long, protesting groan, releasing a breath of air that rushed upward from below, cold, damp, and carrying the sharp scent of earth and decay. Ruth stepped back instinctively, her heart thudding once, hard, against her ribs. The darkness beneath was absolute. Her flashlight beam barely scratched its surface. A narrow set of wooden stairs descended into it, each step worn and uneven, disappearing into blackness after just a few feet. Another sound echoed up from below, closer this time, not loud, but unmistakable. Ruth raised the flashlight, angling it downward, and for the first time she saw something move at the edge of the light. The movement stopped the moment the light touched it. Ruth froze at the top of the stairs, her breath caught halfway in her chest. The beam of the flashlight held steady in her hand, cutting a narrow line into the darkness below. Whatever had shifted was gone now, swallowed by shadow as if it had never been there. She didn't step back. She didn't move forward either. For a long second she stood there, caught between instinct and necessity. The air rising from below was colder than the air in the cabin, damp and heavy. It carried a smell that felt older than anything she had known. Earth, rust, and something faintly metallic beneath it. "Just air," she whispered again, quieter this time. Old wood settling, but she knew the difference between wood and movement. Her grip tightened on the flashlight. She leaned forward slightly, angling the beam deeper. The light stretched down the stairs, revealing uneven steps worn smooth by time. The wood looked fragile but not completely rotten. Enough to hold, maybe. Enough to risk. Another sound echoed up. Not movement this time. A slow, hollow groan, like something deep within the ground shifting its weight. Ruth swallowed. She could turn back, close the door, pretend the cellar didn't exist, stay above, burn through the last of her wood, and hope the storm didn't come hard enough to finish what the bank had started. But hope had already run out. She stepped down. The first stair creaked under her weight, loud, sharp. The sound carried downward, swallowed quickly by the dark. Ruth paused, waiting, listening. Nothing answered. She took another step, then another, each one slower than the last. By the time she reached the bottom, her breathing had grown shallow again, but not from the cold. From the pressure of being surrounded by something unseen. The floor below was packed dirt, uneven but solid. The air felt thicker here, harder to move through. Her light swept across the space, revealing a small cellar room, bare walls, a few broken crates, scattered tools rusted beyond use. Nothing living, nothing moving. Ruth exhaled slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "Nothing," she muttered, "just an old hole." But the relief didn't last, because beyond the cellar there was something else. A second opening. At the far end of the room, a rough-cut tunnel pushed deeper into the earth. It wasn't clean or finished. The edges were jagged, reinforced by thick wooden beams that had darkened with age. The beam of her flashlight barely reached 10 feet in before it was swallowed by shadow again. The sound came from there, not from the cellar, from deeper. Ruth stepped closer, her boots pressing into the dirt floor. The air grew colder the nearer she got, carrying that same faint metallic scent, stronger now. She stopped just at the edge. The tunnel felt different from the cabin above. Not abandoned, waiting, she raised the flashlight and held it steady. The light caught something on the ground just inside the entrance. Wood, broken beams, scattered pieces of old support structures. Dry, splintered, the kind of wood that would burn fast but burn hot, firewood. Ruth stared at it, her mind shifting quickly now. There was more than she could gather in one trip. Enough to last through the storm, maybe longer. Enough to keep her alive if she was careful. She took one step into the tunnel. The temperature dropped immediately. The sound shifted too, echoing differently now, as if the space itself was breathing around her. The beam of light bounced across the walls, catching rough stone and old tool marks left behind by hands long gone. She crouched and picked up a piece of wood. It was dry, lighter than it looked. "Good. Okay," she said softly, more to herself than anything else. "That's something." She reached for another, and then another. Soon she had an armful, enough to make the trip worthwhile, enough to justify coming down here at all. But as she turned to head back, something stopped her. Not a sound, a feeling. She glanced over her shoulder, back into the tunnel. The darkness seemed closer now, not physically, just aware. Ruth hesitated. She should go back. She had what she needed. The storm was coming. There was no reason to go deeper, no reason except one. If this tunnel held more wood, it might hold other things too. Tools, supplies, anything that had been left behind when this place stopped mattering. Anything that could make the difference between surviving and freezing. She adjusted her grip on the wood and set it down near the cellar entrance. "I'll be quick," she said under her breath, as if making a deal she didn't fully trust. Then she turned back and stepped deeper into the tunnel. The beam of her flashlight cut through layers of dust that hung in the air. Each step stirred it slightly, making the light look thicker, almost solid. The walls closed in gradually, the ceiling lowering just enough to make her aware of it. 5 steps. 10, 15. The entrance behind her grew smaller, the air shifted again. That metallic scent returned stronger now. Not just earth and decay, something else, something sharper. Ruth slowed. The ground beneath her boots changed texture, less dirt, more stone. The beam of her light flickered across the wall and stopped. There, half hidden in shadow, was a streak of something different. Not wood, not rust, something embedded in the rock itself. Ruth stepped closer, her heart beating harder now, faster than the climb down had justified. The light hit it directly. And for a brief second, the darkness answered with a faint, dull glimmer. Not bright, not obvious, but unmistakable. Ruth frowned, leaning in just slightly, raising the flashlight higher to catch it again. The glimmer didn't disappear, it held, quiet, patient, as if it had been waiting far longer than she had been alive. Ruth reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the rock, and somewhere deeper in the tunnel, something shifted again. Ruth didn't pull her hand back. The sound deeper in the tunnel faded again, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Not empty, just waiting. Her fingers hovered inches from the rock, trembling, not from fear this time, but from something sharper, recognition. Instinct. She had seen something like this before, not here. Not in a place like this, but years ago in a crowded convention hall in Denver, walking beside Frank while he pointed at polished stones under glass lights. He had talked for hours, explaining things she barely understood, but she remembered one detail clearly. Real gold doesn't shine like you think, he had said, tapping gently on a display case. It doesn't scream for attention, it just sits there, like it knows it's worth more than everything around it. Ruth swallowed hard. The dull glimmer in front of her wasn't bright. It wasn't obvious, but it didn't disappear either. It held steady under the flashlight, buried inside the rock, like something that had been waiting to be noticed. She stepped closer. Her boots scraped against loose stone, the sound echoing sharply down the tunnel. This time, the echo didn't fade quickly. It carried further than it should have. Ruth paused again, listening. Nothing answered. Slowly she reached out. Her fingers brushed the surface of the rock, cold, solid, rough, but the streak embedded within it felt different, smoother, almost soft by comparison. She pressed her thumb against it, testing the surface. It didn't flake away like rust. It didn't crumble like mineral deposits she had seen before. It held. Her pulse quickened. "Don't jump to it," she whispered to herself. "You don't know what this is," but something inside her already did. Ruth pulled back and scanned the ground around her. The tunnel floor was scattered with debris, broken beams, rusted tools, chunks of stone fallen from the walls over time. She set the flashlight down carefully on a nearby rock, angling it toward the streak, then picked up a piece of wood, testing its weight. Too light. She dropped it and reached for something heavier. A rusted iron bar lay half buried near one of the old support beams. It took more effort than she expected to pull it free, the metal scraping against stone with a harsh, dragging sound. The tunnel seemed to react to it, a faint shift, a whisper of movement somewhere deeper in the dark. Ruth froze for a second, her grip tightening around the bar. Then she exhaled slowly. "Just the ground," she said, forcing the words out. She stepped back toward the wall and raised the bar. For a moment she hesitated, not because she was afraid of breaking the rock, because she was afraid of being right. She swung. The impact echoed through the tunnel, loud and sharp. The sound bounced off the walls, traveling deeper, louder than anything she had made since coming down here. Ruth flinched instinctively, her eyes darting into the darkness behind her. Nothing came, no collapse, no movement, just silence settling again. She turned back and lowered the bar, breathing harder now. A small piece of rock had chipped away from the surface. Ruth crouched down, setting the bar aside as she picked up the fragment. It was heavier than she expected. Not dramatically so, but enough to make her notice. She turned it in the light. The streak ran through it, dull yellow, dense, not flaking, not brittle. Her fingers traced along the surface, pressing harder this time. It didn't give. Her chest tightened. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely steady now. "Okay, think." She had to be sure. Not guess, not hope. Sure. Ruth grabbed the iron bar again and struck the vein a second time, harder. The sound rang out again, deeper this time, sending a tremor through the beam above her. Dust fell lightly from the ceiling, drifting through the flashlight beam. Another piece broke free, bigger this time, She crouched again, picking it up with both hands. Heavier, definitely heavier. Ruth stared at it, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore. "If this is what you think it is," she muttered, her voice trailing off. The thought felt too large to finish. She wasn't ready for it. Not yet. A sudden crack echoed behind her. Not from the wall. From deeper in the tunnel. Ruth spun around, raising the flashlight instinctively. The beam shook slightly as it cut through the darkness behind her, catching nothing but drifting dust and uneven rock. But the sound hadn't been imagined. Something had shifted. Something heavier this time. The ceiling creaked faintly, the old beams straining under pressure they had been holding for decades. Ruth's stomach dropped. Too much noise, too much movement. She grabbed the pieces of rock she had broken free and shoved them into the deep pockets of her coat, not caring about the weight now. Then she reached for the stack of firewood she had left behind. Another crack, closer. The ground beneath her boots trembled just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough. "Move," she whispered to herself, her voice tight now. She grabbed as much wood as she could carry and turned toward the cellar entrance, her steps quicker now, less careful. The tunnel didn't like that. The faster she moved, the more the echoes built, the more the old structure responded. Dust shook loose from above, falling in thin streams around her. Halfway back, a sharp snapping sound tore through the space. One of the support beams shifted. Ruth didn't look back. She reached the cellar opening and climbed the stairs as fast as her body would allow, the wood in her arms slipping slightly with each step. Behind her, the tunnel groaned again. Louder, longer. She pushed through the cellar door, stumbling onto the cabin floor as she dropped the wood beside the stove. For a moment she stayed there, her hands pressed flat against the boards, feeling the vibration fade beneath her palms. Then it stopped, completely. The silence that followed was absolute. Ruth slowly pushed herself upright, her chest rising and falling hard as she tried to steady her breathing. Her coat felt heavier now, not from the wood, from what was inside it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the larger piece of rock. It sat in her palm, dense and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But she knew, or at least she thought she did. Ruth walked toward the small table and set the rock down under the flashlight. The dull yellow streak caught the light again. Quiet, unmoving, certain. Her mind raced through everything Frank had ever said, every detail she had half listened to, every explanation she had never expected to need. This wasn't decoration, this wasn't scrap. This was something else, something real, something valuable, something dangerous. Ruth stared at it, her hands resting on the edge of the table as the weight of the realization began to settle in. If she was right, a sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the loose boards and snapping the tarp overhead. The storm had arrived. And this time it wasn't just the cold she had to survive. Because if what she held in her hand was real, then she wasn't alone anymore. Not out here. Not for long. The storm hit before nightfall. Wind slammed against the cabin in long, violent bursts, rattling the loose boards and snapping the tarp overhead like it might tear free at any second. Snow followed soon after, thick, relentless, swallowing the land outside in a matter of minutes. Ruth stayed inside, feeding the stove carefully, one piece of wood at a time. She didn't waste anything. Every movement had purpose now. The rock sat on the table in front of her, illuminated by the narrow beam of the flashlight. She kept glancing at it between motions, as if it might change when she wasn't looking, as if it might suddenly reveal itself as something ordinary. It didn't. It stayed exactly the same. Heavy, quiet, certain. Ruth reached out and picked it up again, turning it slowly in her hands. The yellow vein caught the light in small, dull flashes, not shiny, not decorative. Just there. Her mind worked through everything she remembered. Frank at the kitchen table, flipping through books, talking about mineral veins and fault lines like they were puzzles waiting to be solved. She had never taken it seriously. It had been his hobby, his way of passing time. But he had known what he was looking at, and she had listened just enough. Gold is soft, he had said once. You can mark it if it's real, it doesn't crack like rock, it bends. Ruth set the piece down and reached into her coat, pulling out the iron bar again. She hesitated for a second, then pressed the edge of it firmly against the yellow streak. Slowly she applied pressure. The metal didn't break, It didn't chip, it gave, just slightly. A faint indentation formed where the bar pressed into it. Ruth's breath caught. "No," she whispered, shaking her head once, like she could deny it. "No, that's not, but it was." She knew it now, not hope, not guesswork, knowledge. Her hands trembled as she set the rock back down. "If that's real," she said under her breath, her voice thinner now, pulled tight by the realization. "If that's real, then," she didn't finish the sentence, because the thought didn't come in words, it came in weight, in scale. In the sudden, overwhelming understanding that the ground beneath her feet was not empty, not worthless, not forgotten. It was something else entirely, and the bank had walked away from it. Ruth stood there for a long moment, staring at the rock, her mind trying to catch up with what her hands had already confirmed. Then she moved, not panicked, not rushed, focused. She grabbed the rest of the broken pieces she had chipped off in the tunnel and placed them beside the first one. Smaller fragments, but the same streak ran through them. Proof. Not enough for anyone else yet, but enough for her. She wrapped the pieces carefully in an old cloth she found in one of the drawers, folding it tight, securing it as best she could. Then she paused. Her eyes drifted toward the cellar door. The tunnel below, there was more down there, a lot more, but so was the risk. She remembered the crack of the beam, the shifting ground, the way the tunnel had responded when she moved too quickly, made too much noise. That place wasn't stable. Not anymore. Ruth stepped away from the door. "Not tonight," she said quietly. "You don't get greedy." The words surprised her, because they didn't feel like something she had just thought of. They felt like something Frank would have said. Something simple, practical, grounded. Ruth exhaled slowly and nodded once, as if answering him. "Not tonight." The storm outside intensified, the wind howling now, pushing against the cabin with enough force to make the walls creak in protest. Snow hit the tarp in heavy bursts, the sound sharp and constant. Ruth moved to the door and pressed it tighter into its frame, reinforcing it with a piece of wood wedged against the handle. It wasn't much, but it might slow the worst of it. Then she returned to the table. The cloth-wrapped bundle sat there, small and unremarkable. Anyone else would have seen it as nothing. She knew better. Her gaze drifted to the truck outside. The engine was old, unreliable, but it still ran. Rapid City wasn't that far, not if the roads were still passable. Not if the storm broke soon enough. Ruth's jaw tightened. She couldn't stay here forever. Not without supplies, not without answers, and not without knowing exactly what she was dealing with. She needed someone to confirm it, someone who understood what they were looking at, but that came with its own risk. Because if she was right, then telling the wrong person would be worse than telling no one at all. Ruth sat down slowly, her eyes still fixed on the bundle. The fire crackled softly behind her, the only steady sound in the cabin now. Everything else came and went in waves, the wind, the shifting snow, the occasional creak of the structure holding itself together. But underneath it all there was something else. Faint, almost too subtle to notice, the same low, distant movement from below. Ruth closed her eyes as briefly. The mine, it wasn't quiet anymore. Now that she knew what was inside it, every sound felt different, not random, not meaningless. Like the ground itself was reminding her of what she had just uncovered, and what it might take to keep it. Her eyes opened again. Decision settled in. She stood and walked to the truck, pushing the door open against the wind. The cold hit her hard, sharper than before, but she didn't hesitate. She climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine struggled, once, twice, then caught, a low, uneven rumble. Ruth sat there for a second, her hands gripping the wheel, the sound vibrating through her bones. "If this is real," she said quietly, staring straight ahead, "then everything changes." She reached for the bundle and pulled it close, holding it against her chest like something fragile, something irreplaceable. Then she looked out at the storm. The road was already disappearing under the snow. Visibility dropping, wind pushing harder. If she left now, she might not make it back. If she stayed, she risked something else entirely. Ruth tightened her grip on the wheel. And then headlights cut through the storm in the distance, faint at first, then clearer, moving, coming up the same narrow road she had taken. Ruth's breath slowed. No one should have known she was here. No one. The lights grew brighter, closer, and for the first time since finding the gold, Ruth felt something colder than the storm itself. She wasn't alone out here anymore. The headlights cut through the snow in slow, deliberate pulses. Ruth didn't turn off the engine. She sat frozen behind the wheel, the bundle pressed against her chest, watching the lights grow larger through the storm. The road outside had almost vanished under fresh snow, yet whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The second was the speed. Too steady, too confident, not someone lost, not someone passing through, someone coming here. Ruth's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Her mind moved quickly now, sharper than it had been in weeks. The cold, the exhaustion, the grief, all of it pushed aside by something more urgent. Protect what you have. She glanced down at the bundle in her lap, then back at the lights. If she drove now, she might lose the road completely. The truck barely handled the climb as it was. One wrong turn, one slide, and she'd be stuck out there with no help. If she stayed, they would reach her. Ruth made a decision. Fast. She killed the engine. The sudden silence inside the truck was immediate and heavy. The lights on the dashboard dimmed, then faded out completely, leaving only the storm and the approaching beams outside. She grabbed the bundle and stepped out into the wind. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing her breath for a second. Snow whipped across her face, stinging her eyes as she moved quickly toward the cabin. The headlights were closer now, their glow cutting through the trees just beyond the ridge. No time. Ruth pushed the cabin door open and slipped inside, shutting it hard behind her. The wind rattled it immediately, trying to force it back open, but the wedge of wood held. She moved fast, not panicked, focused. The bundle went straight into one of the loose floorboards near the stove. She had noticed it earlier while checking the structure, a plank that shifted slightly under pressure. Now it mattered. She pried it up just enough to slide the wrapped rocks beneath it, pressing them deep into the space below. Then she forced the board back into place, scraping dirt over the seams with her boot. Hidden, not perfect, but enough. The headlights washed across the cabin walls, bright, close. Ruth straightened, her chest rising slowly as she turned toward the door. A vehicle stopped outside, engine still running. For a moment nothing happened. Then a door slammed. The sound carried through the storm, sharp and clear. Footsteps followed, crunching through snow, slow, deliberate. Ruth didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't have one. Instead, she stepped away from the center of the room, positioning herself near the stove where the light was dimmer. Her posture shifted, not defensive, not aggressive, neutral, but ready. A knock hit the door, 3 times, hard. Ruth didn't answer. The handle rattled once, testing, then again harder. "Open up!" A man's voice called through the wind. "I know someone's in there." Ruth stayed silent. The footsteps shifted outside, moving slightly to the side of the cabin. A second voice spoke, lower, harder to catch over the storm, more than one. Of course there were more than one. The first voice came again, sharper now. "Mom, we're not here to cause trouble, but this is private property. You need to open the door." Private property. Ruth felt something cold and steady settle into her chest. She stepped forward and unwedged the door. When she opened it, the wind forced it back slightly, snow blowing in around her feet. 2 men stood outside, their outlines blurred by the storm, heavy coats, boots sunk into the snow, not locals, too clean, too prepared. The one in front stepped closer, lifting a hand to shield his face from the wind. "You Ruth Gable?" he asked. Ruth met his gaze without answering immediately. "Who's asking?" she said. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just someone trying to make sure you are safe out here," he said. "Storm like this, it's not exactly survivable if you're not set up right." Ruth didn't move. "I'm managing," she said. His eyes flicked past her, scanning the inside of the cabin quickly. The stove, the table, the floor, looking, measuring. The second man stepped closer now, standing just behind the first. "We heard someone was out here," he said. "Figured we'd check it out. Make sure you weren't in trouble." Ruth's gaze sharpened. "Who told you that?" she asked. The first man hesitated just long enough to notice. "Word gets around," he said. "Small town." Ruth almost smiled. There was no town here. Not for miles. The wind howled between them, filling the silence that followed. Snow gathered on the men's shoulders, but neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. They weren't here to help. They were here to confirm. The first man shifted his stance slightly. "You mind if we come in?" he asked. "Warm up for a minute?" Ruth didn't step aside. "No," she said. The answer hung there, flat and final. The man's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. The politeness thinned. "You sure about that?" he said. "Wouldn't want anything happening out here, not with the weather the way it is." There it was, not a threat, not quite, but close enough. Ruth held his gaze. "I've lived through worse," she said quietly. Another pause. The second man leaned in slightly, his voice lower this time. "You find anything out here, Mrs. Gable?" he asked. The question landed clean, no hesitation, no disguise. Ruth felt it, the shift in the air between them. They knew. Not everything, but enough to come looking. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped forward just slightly, enough to force them to take a half step back from the doorway. "This land's mine," she said. "Whatever's here stays here." The first man's smile returned. Wider now, colder. "That's not always how it works," he said. Behind him, the truck's engine idled steadily, headlights still cutting through the storm, illuminating the narrow road like a spotlight. Ruth's eyes flicked past them for just a second, and that's when she saw it, the logo on the side of the vehicle, faint, partially covered in snow, but still visible. A corporate insignia she recognized, not from the mine, not from the land, from the man who had stood on her porch days ago, Harrison Caldwell. The first man followed her gaze, then looked back at her. Something in his expression shifted again. Recognition this time, understanding. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's right." The storm howled louder, filling the space between them. Ruth felt her heartbeat slow. Not from fear, from clarity. They weren't here to ask, they were here to take. And they were already too late. She stepped back and began to close the door. The man's hand shot out, catching it before it shut completely. The wood strained under the pressure. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear it. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be," he said. Ruth met his eyes and didn't let go of the door. "Neither do you," she replied. The wind surged again, pushing against both of them, and somewhere beneath the cabin floor the mine shifted. The wood groaned under the pressure between them. The man's hand held the door firm, fingers spread wide against the splintering frame. Snow pushed in through the gap, swirling between them, but neither of them stepped back. Ruth felt the vibration again beneath her feet, stronger this time, not imagined, not distant. The mine was shifting. Her eyes flicked down for half a second, just enough to feel it, then came back up to the man's face. He noticed. Of course he did, his grip tightened. "What's down there?" he asked quietly, the tone different now, not pretending, not polite, direct. Ruth didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward just slightly, forcing the door inward another inch. The movement surprised him enough that his balance shifted for a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. She shoved, hard. The door slammed into him, forcing him back into the snow. His boot slipped on the ice beneath him, and he stumbled, catching himself just before falling. Ruth slammed the door shut, fast. She dropped the wooden brace back into place, jamming it tighter than before, then stepped back, her chest rising and falling in short bursts. Outside, the man swore loudly. The second man moved forward immediately, their footsteps crunching through snow as they repositioned. One of them struck the door again, harder this time. The wood shook, but held. "For God's sake, open it!" the first man shouted. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Ruth stood still. For a moment, she almost believed him. Then the words settled, and something inside her hardened. "I think I do," she said, her voice low but steady. Another hit against the door, this one sharper. The hinge creaked, straining under the force. The second man's voice came through now, colder. "You're sitting on something you don't understand," he said. "That land isn't safe. That mine's unstable. You stay here, you're dead before the week's out." Ruth's eyes moved toward the floor again. The cellar, the tunnel, the gold, and the cracks. They weren't lying about that part. But they weren't here to save her either. They were here to get there first. Her mind shifted quickly, putting pieces together. They didn't have it yet. If they had, they wouldn't be knocking. They would already be inside. That meant one thing. She still had control. Outside, the first man tried again, his tone shifting back towards something almost reasonable. "Look," he said, breathing heavier now. "We can help you. Get you somewhere safe. You don't want to be stuck out here when that place gives out. You're not equipped for this." Ruth almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because of how familiar it sounded. The same voice, different words. "You don't understand. You're not equipped. Let someone else handle it." She stepped closer to the door. "Then why are you still here?" she asked. Silence, just for a second, long enough, then, "Because someone needs to be," the second man answered. The storm roared louder, drowning the edges of the conversation, but Ruth didn't need to hear more. They weren't leaving, not willingly. She turned away from the door, not to retreat, to think. Her eyes moved across the cabin quickly, the stove, the table, the loose boards, the cellar door. The entire place felt smaller now, more fragile, like it was caught between two pressures, the storm outside, the mine below, and these men in between. Another hit against the door. Harder. The wood splintered slightly near the edge, not enough to break yet. Ruth moved to the stove and grabbed the iron bar again. The weight of it felt different now, not just a tool, but a line she was willing to hold. She stepped back toward the door, not close enough for them to reach, but close enough to be heard. "You break that door," she said. "You don't walk out of here the same way." The words came out calm, not loud, but certain. The first man let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. "You think you can stop us?" he said. "No," Ruth replied. Another pause. Then, softer, "But I don't think you understand what you're standing on either." The wind surged again, slamming into the cabin, rattling every loose board. Snow piled harder against the walls, pressing inward. And beneath it, the ground shifted. This time, there was no mistaking it. A deep rolling crack echoed up through the floor, followed by a sharp snap from somewhere below the cellar. The entire cabin trembled. Both men outside went quiet. Ruth felt it in her knees, in the way the boards beneath her boots flexed just slightly before settling again. The mine wasn't stable. Not anymore, and they had pushed it. The second man spoke first, his voice tighter now. "What was that?" Ruth didn't answer. She didn't need to. Another crack followed, closer. The sound of wood under stress, splintering slowly. Then a heavy thud, from directly beneath the cabin. Ruth stepped back instinctively, her eyes dropping to the floor. A thin line appeared along one of the boards near the cellar door, barely visible, but growing. Outside, the first man cursed again, this time sharper, more urgent. "We need to move," he said. Now, but he didn't step away. Not yet. Greed held him there just long enough. The ground shifted again, this time harder. The entire cabin lurched slightly to one side, a low groan rising from beneath it as something deep in the tunnel structure gave way. Dust pushed up through the cracks in the floorboards. Ruth's heart slammed against her ribs. This was it, not a warning, a failure. She moved fast, not toward the door, toward the hidden floorboard. She dropped to her knees and pried it up, fingers shaking now, not from fear, but urgency. The bundle came free. She shoved it inside her coat. Behind her, the men outside finally stepped back, their boots crunching rapidly through the snow. "Get in the truck," one of them shouted. Too late. Another deep crack tore through the structure below. The cellar door shifted violently, one hinge snapping loose with a loud, splintering pop. The floor dipped, not much, but enough. Ruth staggered back to her feet, grabbing the iron bar with one hand and the wall with the other to steady herself. The cabin was no longer stable, not safe. Not above, not below. Outside, the truck engine roared louder, tires spinning against the snow as they tried to reposition. Ruth turned toward the door. If she stayed, the cabin would go down with her. If she left, she stepped forward, pulling the brace free and throwing the door open into the storm. The wind hit her hard, nearly knocking her back a step. The truck was already turning, headlights swinging wide across the clearing. They were leaving, running, choosing themselves. Ruth stood there for half a second, the storm howling around her, the ground shifting beneath her boots. Then she moved, not toward the truck, toward the edge of the clearing, away from the cabin. Behind her, the structure groaned one last time, a long tearing sound, and then the floor gave way. The floor collapsed with a violent tearing roar. Ruth barely made it 3 steps before the cabin gave way behind her. The sound wasn't just wood breaking. It was the earth itself shifting, a deep, grinding collapse that swallowed the structure whole. She stumbled forward, her boots slipping on loose gravel and fresh snow as the ground trembled beneath her. A blast of dust and splintered wood surged upward behind her, carried into the storm like smoke. She didn't look back, not yet. The wind hit her sideways, pushing her off balance as she struggled to move farther from the edge. Each step felt uncertain, the ground no longer solid in the way it had been minutes before. Somewhere behind her, the last section of the cabin roof gave in with a sharp crack, followed by a hollow thud as it disappeared into the void below. Ruth forced herself another few steps forward before finally turning. The cabin was gone, not broken. Gone. Where it had stood, there was now a jagged collapse, a dark open wound in the earth, partially filled with debris and drifting snow. The cellar, the tunnel, the beams, everything had caved inward, swallowed by the instability she had felt building beneath her feet. The mine had taken it. Ruth stood there, breathing hard, her chest tight, her body still shaking from the sudden shift between survival and loss. Everything she had just secured, her shelter, her fire, the only barrier between her and the storm, was gone. But the bundle was still pressed against her chest. That was the difference. That was the only difference. A low rumble rolled through the ground again, softer this time, settling into place after the collapse. The earth shifted once more, then stilled. For now. Ruth pulled her coat tighter, instinct taking over again. Standing here wasn't an option. The storm was worsening, the cold sharper, the visibility dropping by the second. She turned toward the truck. It was still there, half covered in snow, the engine now silent, the lights off. Beyond it, the other vehicle was already pulling away, its tires struggling against the terrain but gaining distance with every second. They weren't coming back, not tonight. Ruth watched the taillights disappear into the storm, her eyes narrowing slightly. "They'll be back," she said under her breath. Of course they would. Now they knew. She moved toward her truck, her steps slower now, more deliberate. Every part of her body felt heavier, the adrenaline beginning to drain, replaced by something colder and more focused. This wasn't over, not even close. She reached the driver's side door and pulled it open, climbing inside quickly and shutting it against the wind. The cold followed her in anyway, clinging to her clothes, her skin, her breath. For a moment she just sat there, listening, the storm outside, the faint, settling silence of the ground behind her, her own heartbeat. Then she moved again. The bundle came out from under her coat and onto the passenger seat. She unwrapped it carefully, exposing the pieces of rock once more. Even in the dim light of the truck's interior, the yellow veins held, unchanged, unmistakable. Ruth stared at them, her mind moving faster now, sharper than it had been since the eviction. They had come too quickly, too directly. That meant the information had already moved beyond that man, beyond whoever had first seen the rock. It had reached the bank, reached Caldwell. Her jaw tightened. He hadn't just taken her home, he had underestimated her, and now he knew it. Ruth reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folded set of papers, old, worn. She hadn't looked at them in years. The property documents. Frank had kept them, more out of habit than necessity. She remembered him mentioning something about the land once, something about it being odd, something about the way it had been registered. She had never paid attention, now she did. She unfolded the papers slowly, her fingers stiff from the cold, her eyes scanning the faded text, legal descriptions, coordinates, ownership transfer. Most of it meant nothing to her. Until one line caught her attention. A term she didn't recognize. Not land parcel, not standard zoning, something else. A designation tied to mining. Her breath slowed. Frank had known something. Not everything, but enough to notice, enough to keep the land, even when it had seemed worthless. Ruth leaned back slightly, the papers still in her hands as the realization deepened. This wasn't just about what was under the ground. It was about who owned it, and who had the right to take it. The storm outside surged again, rocking the truck slightly, but Ruth barely noticed now. Her focus had narrowed, locked onto the problem in front of her. She needed confirmation. Not from someone who would take it, from someone who would understand it, and more importantly, from someone who could fight for it. Ruth folded the papers back carefully and set them on top of the bundle. Her next move was clear now, not survival, not hiding, action. She reached for the keys and turned the ignition. The engine hesitated, then caught. A rough, uneven rumble filled the cab, vibrating through the seat and into her bones. Ruth gripped the wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, or what was left of it. "If you want it," she said quietly, her voice steady despite everything, "you're going to have to take it the right way." She shifted the truck into gear. The tires spun at first, struggling against the snow, before finally catching enough to move forward. Slowly, carefully, she guided the truck down the narrow path, following the faint tracks left by the other vehicle. Each turn felt uncertain, each stretch of road barely visible, but she kept going, because staying meant losing everything again, and she wasn't going to let that happen twice. The storm swallowed the path ahead, reducing the world to a narrow tunnel of white and shadow. The truck lurched slightly as it hit a deeper drift, then pushed through. Ruth leaned forward, focusing harder, her hands steady despite the conditions. Behind her, the collapsed earth settled into silence. Ahead of her, something else waited. Hours passed, or maybe less. Time blurred in the storm. The road widened eventually, just enough to feel like something closer to a real path. The wind eased slightly, the snow thinning just enough to see more than a few feet ahead, and then lights. Different this time, not moving, stationary, up ahead, just off the main road. Ruth slowed the truck instinctively, her foot easing off the gas. A vehicle sat angled across the path, engine running, lights on, blocking the way forward. Her grip tightened on the wheel. They had gotten ahead of her. The engine of her truck idled low as she brought it to a stop, the storm still swirling around both vehicles. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the driver's side door of the other vehicle opened, and Harrison Caldwell stepped out into the snow. By the time the final ruling came down, the snow in the Black Hills had already begun to melt. Ruth stood just outside the federal courthouse steps, her coat lighter now, not because the weather had warmed, but because something inside her had shifted. The fight that had once felt impossible, too large, too technical, too stacked against her, had reached its end. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with something far more permanent: control. Behind her, Gregory Finch was still speaking with a clerk, gathering the last certified documents. His voice was calm, precise, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way he moved, like a man who had finally closed a case that mattered. Ruth didn't turn back. She didn't need to hear the words again. The federal claim had been upheld. The land, including everything beneath it, was legally hers, protected under mining rights that the bank had failed to recognize, failed to investigate, and ultimately failed to respect. Not because they didn't have the ability, but because they didn't think it was worth their time. That was the truth that had surfaced in court. Not a conspiracy, not some hidden mastermind, just arrogance. Caldwell had signed off on the foreclosure, fast-tracked the asset review, and categorized the Black Hills parcel as negligible, too remote, too unstable, too small to justify deeper inspection. He had believed the numbers in front of him, and ignored everything else. That decision had cost them everything. The bank's legal team had tried to argue procedural boundaries, had pushed for jurisdiction limits, had even attempted to invalidate Ruth's filing based on timing. But Finch had already anticipated every angle. The patent claim had been verified through federal records. The mineral rights were tied directly to the original deed Frank had purchased. And once that connection was established, the case had shifted out of the bank's control entirely. There was no loophole left to exploit, no authority left to appeal to without exposing themselves further. Ruth exhaled slowly. For months, everything had been taken from her piece by piece: her home, her savings, her sense of safety. And now, without raising her voice, without asking permission, she had taken something back. Not just the land, the right to decide what happened next. Footsteps approached behind her. "You should be inside," Finch said gently. "There are still a few things to finalize." Ruth glanced at him, then shook her head slightly. "They can finish without me." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll make sure everything is processed correctly," he said. "The agreements, the transfer structures, the partnership terms, it'll all be documented." She gave a small nod. "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "You know this changes everything, right?" Ruth looked out toward the street, toward the quiet movement of people who had no idea what had just happened inside that courtroom. "It already has," she said. Finch didn't argue. He simply returned inside, leaving her alone with the moment. A few months later, the mine no longer sounded the way it used to. The first time Ruth noticed it, she had been standing just outside the new structure built near the original site. Not a cabin like before, something stronger this time. Reinforced, planned, earned. The low, hollow echo that once drifted from the earth had changed. It wasn't empty anymore, it was active, measured, alive with purpose. The mining operation itself was controlled, limited. Ruth had insisted on that from the beginning. No reckless expansion, no tearing through the land for faster profit. Everything was done with oversight, with intention, with boundaries she set herself. The first deal had come quickly once the legal ownership was secured. Investors, companies, consultants, they all arrived with numbers and promises. Ruth listened, then chose carefully, not the biggest offer. The one that allowed her to keep control. That had been the condition, always. The money came slower that way, but it came. More than enough, far more than she had ever imagined needing. And yet the first thing she built wasn't a house, it wasn't luxury, it wasn't escape, it was something else entirely. The oncology center sat on the edge of Rapid City, not far from where the hospital had once sent her bills she couldn't pay. The building wasn't massive, but it was modern, fully staffed and designed for one purpose: to give people time. Time that she and Frank hadn't been able to buy. The plaque near the entrance didn't carry her name, it carried his, Frank Gable. She visited often but never for long. Just enough to walk through the halls, to see the quiet rooms, the careful work being done. Enough to remind herself why she had chosen this instead of something easier, something more selfish. On one of those visits, she paused outside a window, watching a nurse guide a patient through a slow walk down the corridor. There was no rush, no urgency that felt like panic. Just time. Ruth placed her hand lightly against the glass. "You should had this," she whispered. There was no answer, but there didn't need to be. Weeks later, she returned to the Black Hills. Not for business, not for meetings, just to stand where it had all started. The new structure stood firm where the old cabin had once been. The ground had been stabilized, reinforced after the collapse, the dangerous sections sealed off or secured, but the entrance to the mine remained, untouched. Ruth walked toward it slowly, her steps steady, her posture no longer shaped by survival alone. She paused at the edge, listening. The sound that came from below wasn't hollow anymore. It wasn't something that felt like it could swallow her whole. It was steady, grounded. Like something that had finally been seen for what it truly was. Not a place to be buried, but a place that held value no one had bothered to look for. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. For the first time in a long time, there was no urgency pressing against her chest, no fear of what would be taken next, only space and choice. When she opened her eyes again, she turned away from the mine, walking back toward the structure, toward the life she had rebuilt from something everyone else had dismissed. She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because nothing beneath the surface was hidden anymore, and nothing that belonged to her could be taken so easily again. If you had been in her place, would you have fought for what they said was worthless, or walked away before discovering what it truly held?